Now you can imagine how much discussion and negotiation had to go on just to decide. You've got 3 or 4 people saying, what are we going to do? Are we going to do something different every week, or are we going to do one thing? Yeah. And then also week to week, when it got to the topic, I had to produce this digital response in the 2 hours of the tutorial. Now this digital response, this is from the group who decided not to be anything in particular. And this week the topic was observation and planning. And what they wanted to do was, that week they wanted to pretend that they were all teachers in a staff meeting, having a conversation about how they were approaching observation and planning. And they were worried about how do we do this in a digital way. And so what I suggested to them was that they go onto the website. Remember, I'm really interested in using technologies for a purpose. So I said to them, go into the website, go into the chat room, and have your professional learning conversation in the chat room as a chat. Because I knew that I could go, as the instructor, I can go into the chat and access the chat. So I said to them, once you've had the chat, I'll go into it and I'll copy and paste the chat into a Word document for you, and then you can print it off. Yeah? So they went in and they basically did their role play. So here they are pretending to be teachers. So one of them's pretending, I don't know how to do it. So one's saying, how's everyone going doing this observation and planning? And this one says, I'm trying to do it, but it's really hard. And this one's saying, you know, so, and then one pretends that they're really good at it and gives advice, etc., etc. So once I copied and pasted it into the Word document for them, I showed them, because then they were talking about it and they're going, oh, when you pretended to say this, that was like this idea in the readings. And another one was saying, when you said this, that reminded me of the idea in the second reading. So then I asked them if they knew about, you know, comments in Word, how you can put comments in a document. Are you familiar with this? Yes, no? Yeah. So I showed them how to use comments. So then what they did is they used comments to analyse their own role play. Yeah, does that make sense? So that was their digital response. Now I thought that one wouldn't get many votes because it didn't look, you know, really fancy, but the week that they did that, they got the most votes that week. So the students were actually able to see that that was multi-layered work, that they'd done the role play and then they'd analysed their own role play. So that one got lots of votes. This was from the people who were pretending to be the LEA, and it was the week that it was brain development. Do you want to see that again? And what they wanted was, they said that if in their counts, in their group, they might be running prenatal classes for people who are going to be parents, and that they would want parents to know the importance about children's brain development, and they might give the parents a puzzle to do about children's brain development. It took them a long time to come up with this. First of all, they wrote pages and pages of information that they were going to give to the parents. And when I was teaching this unit, I had a 3-year-old, I had 2 under 3, and I had 2 children very young, and I said to them, I don't have time as a parent to sit down and read all your information about brain development. You've got to work out a better way of attracting my attention. And so what they did is they did this puzzle. So saying this part of the brain is about feelings, and it develops 10 months to 2 years. So they've had to do a lot of reading to get to this point. This part of the brain is about sensory, develops from birth. This is about vision, yeah? And then as you pull away the parts of the puzzle, it tells parents what sort of things they can do with their baby that will support that aspect of development. Hug, kiss, cuddle, smell, touch, taste, read, sing, talk, look, observe, notice, crawl, walk, run, dance. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so that's...
Excuse me.
Yes?
Will students be given some criteria on casting the vote? Or it's just all open?
No, or whatever they thought was the best one.
Best in what?
Which one they liked that week.
Like,
Yeah.
you can like, well, this one is more colorful.
Yeah.
That one more cute.
Yeah.
Then how can we help the synthesis part or students have diverse ability in catching,
Attention.
not catching attention, in getting the things from the learning activities. Some of them can pick it up. They have insights in, after doing all these, I learned this method. But some others can get lost in, these kind of activities.
Mhm.
How can
because-
we step into?
Because it's small groups, yeah, they tend to support each other a lot. And so Amy might be really, really good at using images on the computer. And maybe Serena doesn't know how to do that, but Serena's actually really good at taking an idea and working out how to make that information about brain development useful to parents. And so then Serena has to say to Amy, I think, a way to help parents understand this would be to give them a puzzle. And then Amy's going, what do you mean a puzzle? And how do I show that using images? And so then Serena has to go, well, maybe how do we, feelings is really important. And so what they do is they start to come closer together in that Peggy's good at one thing, Amy's good at another, but because they have to work out how to develop this response, they slowly come closer and closer so that Peggy gets Amy's skills and knowledge and Amy gets Peggy's skills and knowledge. The other thing is, hang on a minute, because they're developing these digital responses, I said you've got 2 hours in the tutorial, you've got to get it done in the 2 hours of the tutorial. So they didn't mess around, they worked very intensively, but I was there, right? And remember, this is their assess task, so I would come up to this group and I would help build those negotiations and the perspective taking and the synthesis in the group. And so these presentations form part of their first assessment, but that meant that I could be teaching while they were doing the assessment. Because if you don't understand something, I know now while you're working on it that you don't understand it. And so I can come and talk to you about it. In traditional assessment, we give the lecture, they go away, we give the assignment, and you mightn't understand something and you're at home doing it, and I'm not there to know that you don't understand it. So I can't teach you at the moment of when you're working on the assessment. And I think what's very, very important is that a teacher is there to help the learning that happens at the moment of the assessment. Yeah? And so I started to develop this idea, which I'll talk about later, which I call teaching through assessment, because I would be teaching as the students were doing the assessment. So my teaching would happen through the assessment. So the assessment wasn't just about finding out how much do you know. The assessment was actually about how can we learn together. Well, 1, 2, 3.
Do these student votes count?
No, the student votes had nothing to do with the assessment. That's just a bit of fun. Yeah, no.
Though you had answered it, the role of the teacher, so the role of Susan during the work, during tutorials was about noticing, observing, asking questions, scaffolding students' learning. So she's walking around watching them work. She might be asking a question. She might be, that's her pedagogy as an educator.
I'll give you an example. So one of the first topics was actually the image of the child. How do we see children? Do we see them as weak and vulnerable, or do we think they're strong and competent, and all of these different ideas? And one group decided to be a childcare centre. And I hope this isn't a rude word in this country, because when I presented it in Ireland it was.
What's the
So,
word?
No.
No.
Good.
Well, I don't know. I might not be the best person to ask.
If I say a rude word, I apologise
Okay.
in advance. So they decided that what they would call their childcare centre was little buggers. Now in Australia, the word when applied to children sort of means cheeky little people, doesn't it, Sue? It's sort of an affectionate term that you would use with very young children in Australia, meaning, oh, you're such a cheeky little person, they'll say, you cheeky little bugger, like this. When I presented this work in Ireland, buggers is a very rude word, and I didn't know. So I said little buggers, and they were like this. So now I'm being very cautious. about this. Now, so they said, okay, we're going to call our centre Little Buggers. Now, all of the reading had been about how do you respect children? How do you talk about children? What beliefs do we have about children? How do we see children? Okay, so here they are working in their group and they're developing a pamphlet to advertise their Little Buggers childcare centre to parents. And they're writing their philosophy statement all about what they valued about children's education. So I read their philosophy statement and it said, at Little Buggers, we believe children are strong and capable and, you know, all of these things they're saying and that relationships are important, etc., etc. And around their statement, their philosophy statement, so they had the Little Buggers in really cute text, you know, that one with the crayons and all very cutesy. And then around the border they had these little, you know, have you seen that border that's little handprints? I don't know if you've seen this. It's a very cute border all around it. And so I went up to that group and they're very engaged and they're developing this pretend childcare centre and I read their statement. And because they were doing the assessment and I was there at that time, I could say to them, do you think what you have called your childcare centre matches what you are saying is important about caring for infants and toddlers? I didn't say it that bluntly. And then I said to them, and this cute little, you know, writing and the pretty little hands all around it, how is, you know, is that really respectful? Is that really matching what you're saying in your writing? Because they've got all this writing, which is like an essay on this is what you have to say about image of the child. And they sat there and they were quite stunned. And I said, no, it actually doesn't match. What we're saying that we believe about young children from our readings and from the lecture, we haven't actually illustrated that in the way we've presented our digital response. And because what they had done was the image that they had created in the digital response is all about being cute and funny. But what they wanted to say about children was that children are clever and capable and serious. And so they had this mismatch, you see. And at the end of that conversation, one of them said to me, oh, I never realised before that the theory that you read about, you had to actually show it in your practice. So that was very exciting. Yeah, because this is happening in the university classroom. She's not even out in the field yet. She's made this enormous connection that when I read this theory, in my practice, if I'm generating documents, my documents have to reflect my reading of the theory, yeah? So then they went and they rewrote it and they did it all again. And they didn't call themselves Little Buggers. I think they called themselves Equality. Because what they wanted to talk about, they called themselves Equality Childcare because they wanted to talk about quality childcare, but they also wanted to talk about equality, as in all people being welcome in the centre. So can you see what an enormous shift from saying Little Buggers to equality? Because doing the digital responses in the class meant, and that was your question, how do you do the learning and the perspectives, meant that I could be there in the moment. If they'd done that at home and I wasn't there, they'd submit it and I'd give them maybe a pass. Yeah, but I was there to challenge the learning and the thinking and lift it right up to a whole new level. Okay, so, how are you going? Yes.
I just want to say each week, different groups will be producing different digital response to reading or whatever. As a lecturer, did you encounter any problems in setting up the assessment rubrics?
No, and if I had it, I could show you, because the assessment rubric would be like references to readings. You know, it would have like draws on ideas, you know, from the lecture content or whatever. So that was still broad. Yeah. You ready for one more? This is the last one. So we've done, remember, and these examples I've shown you are all based off this model that I've been using in my practice. So the first one we looked at was the problem-based learning. So that was with the Laura story. And the second one we looked at was the digital responses. The digital responses attracted a lot of interest, and I've presented digital responses in a lot of places, and it's actually been picked up as a model that's been used in Belfast, all through my other university and at some other universities in Australia, and not just in early childhood education. It got picked up and used in medicine, nursing, law, all different sorts of places, so it was a very successful idea.
That's called impact. Impact. That's how you show evidence of impact from your teaching. So it's not just the outcome of a research paper. This is where the impact matters in a different way.
Good, Mindy. I didn't think of that. Okay, so example 3 now we're into, and this one's peer-assisted learning. And remember, this afternoon I'm going to show you all the theory and the research underpinning this, and then how I articulated it into publications. So this bit's just still about the examples, but it's great to have this session first because there's so much there. Okay, so this is the same idea. So the teaching and learning in this example, which is on peer-assisted learning, which is PAL for short, and it also has peer-assisted teaching. So I was co-teaching with a colleague, which is PAT for short. So the teaching and learning is collaborative. In this one, in this course, what we asked all the students to do, and this one was developed after I had done this, we asked all of the students to invent their own service. It might be a childcare centre or a kindergarten, and once again they're working in groups, and that they would actually develop digital responses for their childcare centre each week. So you can start to see some of the practices, the principles I was developing as I went on, that I learned that works, this weekly idea works, digital responses works, fictional sense, context work, you know. And then the assessment was they're inventing a service, which meant that it gave them an opportunity to learn the content as they created their service. And once again, the technology was about accessing, creating and sharing content. The technology wasn't just about, here's a question on the discussion forum, please answer my question. Okay, so up the top here, this is what the home page would look like. And so once again, these students are in groups, but this time, instead of being able to be anything they like, oops, I should have kept HC Annie there. So this time, instead of being able, and this was a different unit of study as well. This unit of study was on assessing children's learning. I think it was 0 to 5. So, all in groups again, usually groups of 4. What was really interesting, one of the things I started to notice about this way of working was that what would happen a lot of the time was that the local students, the Australian students, would always want to work with Australian students, and the international students would always want to work with the international students. And what I noticed was that in working this way, they'd be much more happy to work with each other because they could actually support each other and share ideas, and they would get richer work because Mindy could say, well, you need to, in my experience in America, it's like this, and HC could go, well, in my experience, it's like this. And that they learned that to work together meant that they got richer perspectives. And so then they actually started to seek out the opportunity to work together because they knew that would give them better quality work. So in this one, everybody had to develop a childcare centre, but they could come up with a name. They could write their own name themselves. They had to write their philosophy statement, what our centre's about. They had to develop a logo. They had to develop all different policy statements. And every week, once again, there'd be a topic. So it might be on approaches to observation, assessment, whatever. And then they would have to develop each week something for their centre. So in the first week, they had to develop their name and their logo and write their philosophy statement. In the second week, they had to show how they were going to observe children's learning. In the third week, they had to show how they were going to do curriculum planning, for example. And once again, I would give them a space on the website. So if their centre was called Bumblebees, I would write up Bumblebees, and then that's where they would go and post their work. But this one was a little bit different, and I'll show why. So here's the home page, then this would give them the weekly topics. But what I did in this one is, because this is when I started to go, I'm not really so happy anymore about giving this 1 hour lecture. So here I am believing about social cultural, social constructivist learning and opportunities to create knowledge and share knowledge, and I'm still standing up here giving these lectures. And the other thing is this was just when Web 2 was taking off, and I started thinking this is just not making sense to me, because these students can go online and find out anything they want, really, about different theories, you know, on child development. They can go on YouTube and hear expert professors, Small Open World, talking about it. Why would they want to come and hear me talk about it at my university? And students were starting to not come as much to lectures because they knew that if they didn't come, it didn't matter because it would be recorded and it would be online anyway. And so I'm thinking, oh, you know, I don't know that there's such a strong place for these 1 hour lectures anymore. What can I do about this? And so what I decided was that before they came to the tutorial is I would put some stuff up online that I wanted them to do first. And I started to try and make this quite multimedia based, multimodal. So there would be a reading, a journal paper that they would have to do. I would find some video, it might be on YouTube, sometimes it would be somewhere else that I wanted them to watch. All of this was stuff that was connected to the same idea. Maybe a reflective piece of reading, and then what I also started to do was go and have, I had a channel on YouTube, and I would go and interview people who I just thought were really interesting. So I would go and have a chat with a teacher and just ask her questions about her teaching, or I'd go and interview someone from an LEA, or I'd interview, if you were there, Sue, I would have interviewed you. And I'd have these conversations with people, all different people, and I'd put them on my YouTube channel so that students could listen to them. They're just really informal chats. And so that would be an audio cast, and so the students could listen to that. And so I would ask them to do all of these things before they came to the tutorial. Now normally what happens is they would have a lecture and a tutorial, and then you do the reading, yeah? Does that sound, that's familiar? But what I did is I had to do the pre-online classes first, usually on their own, but they could do it with their peers. Then we had the tutorial, and in the tutorial they would develop their work for their centre, and then they would post their work for the centre online, and in the lecture, I didn't talk. And in the lecture what would happen is Mindy and Mindy's group might come up, and they would have to present what their centre had developed in the tutorial based on their reading. Now one of the things that happened in the tutorial before the students did the work is that myself and my colleague Jane Bone, we would sit, so we get a chair. Do you want to come to Mindy? So Mindy's going to teach us Jane, which is okay, she'll just all of the students, all of you would have done your reading, watched the YouTube, listened to the audio cast, and Jane and I, or Mindy and I, would also have done that, and you would come into the tutorial, and then Jane and I would just sit and we would start to talk, and I'd say, oh Mindy, so what did you think about the reading?
Oh, I thought it was really interesting. The part I really liked was about blah, 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 blah.
Oh, Mindy, really? I kind of, God, I hated that bit, because when I read theory all about Vygotsky, and Vygotsky doesn't agree with that idea.
Well, that's interesting. What does Vygotsky believe?
And so then I would explain that, or Mindy Jane might say, well, but the theory I read is a different theory and it doesn't agree.
And it says blah, 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 blah.
And so I thought, I never thought of that before. And so have these conversations, and then I'd go, oh, so when we watch that video of the little baby, you could say that Vygotsky sees it like this, but your theory sees it like this. And, you know, and Jane Windy would go, yeah. And so we'd have these conversations for about the first half an hour. So this is the peer-assisted teaching. We're teaching together. And the students would listen. And then after about half an hour, they'd start going, oh, I'm trying to say something. Because they're listening, because they've done all the reading and the watching. And then they're listening, and then they'd get desperate. They'd get, please, let me say something. And so then we'd open it up for discussion. And then for the next half an hour, we'd discuss. And then the second hour of the tutorial, they would go into their groups and write their work for their childcare centre. And then the third hour was the lecture. So then we would go to the lecture theatre, and then Sue, your group, would come up and present the work that you had done that week. And then in the lecture, because all the students had been through the same process, they would ask very insightful, critical questions of that centre. You did it like that, Sue, but our group's done it like this. So how come you've done that? Are you using this theory or that theory, and why have you done that, and what does that mean for how you're observing, etc. Does that make sense? Yep.
I think what I like that Susan's done is that when we were at Monash, we had to work within, just like you do here, you've got so many hours of contact time, but how you use that contact time was up to us. So it didn't mean that you had to use the hour lecture like an hour lecture. She used that time so that students were actually presenting. But Susie, the teacher, though, you know, she's still teaching, but it's a different way of using your pedagogical expertise. So she was using it with Jane, the other co-teacher, during the workshop.
And also during the lecture. So during the lecture, HC, you might be up here as a student presenting, and so I would sit down here with Jane, and then you might finish talking about what your group had done, and Sue might actually be quite critical of what you have done because her group's done something else. And so then Jane and I would have to help you both have a respectful conversation about that disagreement. And sometimes they actually got quite, so very invested in it by then, and it's like their centres became very real to them. And so then, you know, so when we were doing even though I'm not behind the podium anymore as the teacher, I'm doing a lot of teaching, and I would ask questions still. Why have you done that, HC? What theory were you drawing on? What's it going to mean in practice if you do that? What's going to happen to the children? Yeah.
So it's a different way of thinking about the teacher. The teacher is no longer this, you know, I'm going to dump the knowledge in. It's about getting the knowledge out, and then the teacher becomes like a connector and a scaffolder. So it's a different way of using your expertise and what you know as a teacher, as an educator.
So I'll skip through this because it's getting tired now. So here's the home page, and then they click on this link called Sharing Our Services. Now here are all the different kindergartens they've invented. So one's called Joy Kids Early Learning, Rainbow Early Learning, Caterpillar Cove, Hands On. But can you see, you could think, okay, if they've called theirs Hands On Learning, what do you think they believe about, what's their philosophy going to be, you know? Discover Moments Preschool, The World Around Us Early Learning Centre, Bread, Eggs and Ham. We did have some conversation about people's beliefs about food and what sort of families you might attract. They like that name a lot. And so then they would click on there. If you've called yours Rainbow Early Learning Centre HC, you would click on that, and then you would put up your weekly stuff. And then when it was your turn to lecture, you just come up, go on the web, find your work, bang, it's there, the lecture's ready to roll. And so this is where they would post comments and discussions about each other's work. That's an example of some work that some students developed where they were trying to talk about the relationship between, this is, the year that we did this was the first year that Australia's Early Learning Framework came out, and this is where students were trying to explain how they were relating the different principles to the learning outcomes and how they would do that in their childcare centre. So just to now conclude, with about 3 minutes to go. So remember that I started saying with this model? Yep. So the very first thing for me is always the pedagogy. It's never the technology. never start with the technology, I always start with the pedagogy. What do I want to happen? Why group work? What's my rationale for group work? Why is peer-assisted learning? Why is problem-based learning going to be the best approach? And the next thing I always think about is that I want assessment, the assessed task, to be an opportunity for the students to be really deeply involved in their learning, but I also want it to be an opportunity for me to teach, like with the little buggers, yeah? That I can get in there and really do some teaching. So it's not just about asking the students to prove what they know from my course. The assessment's actually an opportunity for them to learn and for me to teach. And then I use the technologies and what technology has to offer so that it actually supports the pedagogy that I want to enact and the assessed tasks that I want the students to do. There we go, that was a good effort.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I think what we will do, since it is time for us to leave this room, is that maybe for those of you who are able to come back, when we begin the next session at 2 o'clock, we'll save the first 15 minutes for if you've got questions about this. How does that sound? Yep. Okay, great. So I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that you got at least 3 new ideas of how somebody has really rethought her classes and has brought together this idea of technologies and assessment and teaching and learning, very active teaching and learning.
And this afternoon there'll be all theory.
Okay.